There are lots of options. I can tell you like the kids to be in one area and the adults.
David Bromstad built a career turning other people's broken houses into something worth living in. And in 2023, a storm took his own home apart board by board while he kept filming television and pretending nothing had changed. What followed was not a dramatic public unraveling. It was something quieter and more dangerous, a slow erosion that addiction, displacement, and unresolved trauma drove from the inside out, until the interior design star who made home renovation look effortless had no stable ground left to stand on. The flooding that hit his Florida property did not negotiate. Water moved through every room, saturating structural elements, destroying the finished interior he had spent years building, and creating the conditions for mold to spread into surfaces that could not be saved. What the storm left behind was a shell, exposed beams, torn-out walls, and the constant reminder of something that could not be fixed on any reasonable timeline. What had taken years to construct came apart in hours, and when the water pulled back, the house Bromstad returned to was unrecognizable. Understanding why that loss carried such unusual weight requires stepping back from the television personality and looking at what the Florida home actually represented in his life. For most of his adult career, every space he designed served someone else, a client's vision, a network's expectations, a camera's needs. His Florida property was the first home he had ever created entirely for himself, with no brief to follow, no audience to satisfy, and no deadline attached. Every color he selected, every piece he placed, every detail he finished existed because it reflected who he was when the performance stopped. The house carried vivid personal specificity, pieces from his childhood placed alongside furniture he had chosen without justification, color running through every room with the kind of confidence that only comes when someone stops designing for approval. He cooked there, slept there, sat in those rooms after long filming days, and felt the pressure ease in a way it did not ease anywhere else. That kind of space is not replaceable through insurance settlements or contractor timelines. It functions as emotional architecture, and when the storm took it apart, something functional in him went with it. None of that registered publicly right away, and that delay was part of what made the situation dangerous. In the weeks after the flooding, Bromstad kept his schedule intact. Production continued, cameras rolled, and the familiar version of him, energetic, optimistic, in control, showed up on set without visible fracture. Mental health professionals would recognize this pattern immediately, the performance of stability while the internal structure quietly fails. Without the house to return to, there was no space where the performance could stop. Every environment now required maintenance of the image, and the cost of that maintenance was accumulating faster than he could pay it. Stress without an outlet does not dissolve. It compounds, and that is what happened here. Insurance disputes dragged on, rebuilding timelines kept extending, and temporary housing offered none of the belonging the Florida home had provided. Each delay added weight to a situation that had no release valve, and that is when alcohol and substances stepped into the gap. Not dramatically, not in any way that triggered obvious alarm in the people around him. Gradually, one decision leading to the next, until what had started as a way to quiet the noise after a long day became something that operated on its own schedule, independent of his intentions. What developed during this period was erosion, not explosion. Tolerance built slowly. The distance between the person on screen and the person existing privately grew wider without any single moment marking the shift, and sleep broke down in stages, first inconsistent, then fragmented, then unreliable in ways that affected everything downstream. Emotional regulation weakened at the edges before it weakened at the center. Underneath all of it, experiences from earlier in his life, from adolescence, from periods of feeling exposed and unprotected, started surfacing with a clarity he had not invited and could not manage without chemical help. Rehabilitation would eventually reframe this sequence, But during this period, he was not thinking about underlying patterns. He was thinking about getting through the next day. The substances did not solve anything, and he likely understood that on some level, but they delayed the moment when he had to sit with losses he was not equipped to process without support. Alcoholism in this context was not self-destruction chosen freely. It was a coping mechanism that had outlasted its usefulness and was now creating the very conditions it had been recruited to prevent. He kept working through it, kept meeting production expectations, kept maintaining the surface while the foundation continued to deteriorate beneath a professional schedule that never paused to ask whether he was okay. When he entered treatment, the first phase centered on physical stabilization, and his body made clear how much sustained stress it had absorbed over those months. Sleep arrived in fragments rather than stretches. Energy came in unpredictable peaks before dropping without warning, and removing alcohol and substances from his system did not produce immediate relief. Fatigue deepened before it eased, concentration dropped before it returned, and the nervous system that had been running in a state of low-level emergency needed time to learn that the emergency had passed. Depression and anxiety, previously muted by substance use, now registered at full volume with nothing to soften the signal. The emotional phase that followed was harder than the physical one. With the chemical layer gone, thoughts arrived without the buffer that had been filtering them for months, and feelings he had delayed, some of them going back years, surfaced without scheduling and without warning. Therapy sessions during this period pushed into patterns he recognized but had never examined with any discipline. He saw how quickly he reached for control when uncertainty appeared, how productively he had used busyness as a form of emotional avoidance, and how the Florida house had been functioning as a psychological container that held together parts of his inner life he had never directly confronted. When the storm stripped that container down to its frame, the internal structure collapsed with it. That reframing shifted the recovery from addressing storm damage to addressing something much older. The sense of being exposed and unprotected that the flooding triggered echoed earlier experiences from adolescence: bullying, instability, the feeling of having no safe place to land. Home renovation had been, in some subconscious sense, Bromstad's answer to that earlier displacement, and the Florida house had been the fullest expression of that answer. Losing it did not just remove a property. It reopened a wound that had never fully closed, and rehabilitation now required working at that deeper level rather than simply treating the symptoms that had emerged in 2023. The third phase of treatment focused on rebuilding regulation, not identity, not career, but the basic capacity to recognize when overload was approaching and respond before it escalated into crisis. Restlessness before it became anxiety. Shallow breathing before it became panic. Irritability before it became full withdrawal. He practiced identifying those physical cues early and responding without self-judgment, which meant breaking the pattern that had defined most of his adult life, where endurance passed for strength and pausing passed for failure. Sobriety during this phase stopped being framed as deprivation and started being understood as the condition that made any other kind of functioning possible. Leaving treatment brought no surge of confidence, no sense that the work was finished or the damage undone. What he experienced instead was sharpness, daily life arriving at full intensity without any buffer between him and its demands. The decision to travel to Norway alone to mark his 50th birthday came from that same place of intentional exposure rather than celebration. He needed physical distance from environments that carried accumulated weight, and he needed terrain that demanded full presence rather than permitting retreat into familiar habits. Climbing Rheinebringen on that trip became something he would return to in describing his recovery, not because reaching the top produced emotional release, but because the climb required him to stay completely present inside his own body. Fatigue could not be numbed. Fear had to be moved through rather than around, and each section of the ascent demanded pacing and attention with no room for distraction. What he found at the top was quieter than euphoria. The recognition that he could sit inside discomfort without reaching for escape, that the capacity existed and had always existed, even when he had not trusted it. That recognition carried more practical value than resolve alone because it was proven rather than promised. Back in Florida, the house remained unfinished, the problems still waiting, the rebuilding timeline still uncertain. What had changed was not the circumstances. It was his relationship to them. And that shift, from requiring resolution before stability to building stability in the presence of ongoing difficulty, changed everything about how he moved through each day without numbing it first. Going public came after that stability had been established, not before, and the timing was deliberate in a way that reflected how far he had come. The HGTV special, documenting the house rebuild, became the vehicle for something much larger. The first time Bromstad connected the physical destruction directly to the relapse, the treatment, and the internal collapse the storm had set in motion. He spoke about substance abuse without dramatizing it, described the treatment process without minimizing what it cost, and laid out the sequence of events with the kind of precision that comes from having genuinely processed something rather than simply survived it. Viewers responded with recognition rather than shock, and that response confirmed something he had not fully anticipated. The messages he received focused less on the storm and more on the admission that professional success in television, the career, the visibility, the reputation built over years on HGTV had not protected him from breaking down completely, and that the breakdown had followed a logic other people recognized in their own lives. What he had expected to damage his public standing instead created something more durable. Credibility earned through accuracy rather than performance. Professionally, the disclosure stabilized rather than disrupted his work. He continued operating in television but with restructured limits around workload and availability, no longer using the job as a mechanism for outrunning difficulty, no longer treating constant momentum as a professional virtue. The rebuilt Florida house stood again, finished and livable, carrying the same visual confidence that had always defined his work in interior design. But it no longer carried the weight of keeping him together. That responsibility had moved inward, and it stayed there. Sobriety, in the life he built after rehabilitation, was not framed as discipline or deprivation. It was the condition that made presence possible, the thing that allowed him to stay in the room with difficulty instead of stepping out of it. He monitored physical signals because he now understood that his body delivered accurate information about his emotional state before his mind was ready to admit anything. He rested before reaching exhaustion. He addressed pressure before it compounded, and when the Florida house finally stood rebuilt and complete, it reflected a person who had stopped expecting external structure to hold him together and had learned, slowly, imperfectly, with professional support, to carry that work himself.